Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thank you so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us. I know we say this all the time, but some of you have never heard it before. We know there are other places you could be. There are other things you could be doing. You chose to be here with us. We just don't ever take that for granted. So thanks so much for spending an hour or so of your Sunday morning here with us. We are, most of you guys know, but again, some of you don't. We are in the middle of a very long series of messages called the Jesus Project. Our goal in the Jesus Project series has been to go from beginning to end through the four Gospels and look at everything that Jesus said, everything that Jesus did, and ask ourselves whether maybe or not over time we have had some bad assumptions and ideas about who Jesus is kind of creep into our thinking about who he is and what he would say and what he would do in certain circumstances, and whether or not we could sort of strip some of those away and try to see Jesus for who he is, hear Jesus for what he said, see Jesus for the things that he did, and in doing that, if we could just follow him a little bit better. So I felt like when I started this series, it was a 3-year journey. I just want you to know, I just finished writing half of the messages. So we're almost halfway. We're getting there. Just in case you were wondering how much longer this is going to last, we've got another year and a half plus for us to go through this. We are going to be this morning in our problem child gospel, as I have called it over the last several months. We're going to be in the Gospel of John. I call John the problem child because he's the one that chronologically really doesn't sort of fit inside of Matthew, Mark, and Luke's story of the 3 years of Jesus' life. It's always hard to fit him into different spots and in different places. And the passage that we're going to talk about this morning is particularly difficult, and we'll talk about why in just a couple minutes, but just so you know, I'm just kind of prepping you. This is a tough one for us to deal with. In some respects, there's a couple things that we got to deal with before we get there. Several years ago, I went to a church leadership conference, and I heard one of my favorite pastors, a guy named Andy Stanley, speak, and he talked about, what it was like leading a church, and he did this brilliant talk about how so many times in church life and in church world, we think that there are two competing things on two sides of every coin, and every question has to have a yes or no answer. It's got to be resolved in one direction or the other. And one of the things that he told us, and one of the things that I thought was super helpful for me as a pastor and a church leader, was to recognize that not every question has to be resolved with one side or the other. That so many times inside of church life, and then I started to realize that this isn't just true in church life, but this is true in every aspect of your life. So many things are not questions to be resolved. So many of them are tensions that always have to be managed. Always have to be managed. He talked about, I remember particularly, he was talking about the idea that on a given Sunday, you are preaching to people who have 40 years of following Jesus and have 4 days of following Jesus. And how do you preach to people across that spectrum? And he said, sometimes we feel like we got to lean in one direction or the other. And he said, no, it's not something that you've got to resolve. It's just this tension that always has to be managed as you're trying to preach and lead people. And this is something that I think I've sort of gifted myself with over the course of my life. Once I heard that framework, I was like, not every question needs to be resolved. Not everything is yes or no. Sometimes it's maybe. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's not either this or that. Sometimes it's both of those things, and you've got to figure out how to hold both of those things in tension inside of your life, inside of your marriage, inside of your relationship with your kids, inside of your workplace. Not every tension, I'm just going to tell you this, not every tension in every relationship in your life is always going to be resolved. Some of them are just going to have to be managed, and that's okay. In fact, the more complex things are, the more often I think we find that they are not always questions to be resolved. They are actually tensions that have to be constantly managed in our lives. Most of the world functions on paradoxes, right? Like you think about it. And then if you think about applying that over into how you think about God, which is what we're trying to do in a series like this, in a church like this, it's trying to deal with how do you deal with the eternity of God and the, finiteness of us as human beings. How do we put those two pieces together? How do we manage all of these paradoxes? Because some paradoxes, some apparent paradoxes, at least on the surface, are not questions to be resolved. They are tensions to be managed. Have you ever had some time to think deeply about God? You sat out by a fire somewhere, or you sat out in the woods somewhere, or you sat down by the ocean, whatever your place is, that gets you to think big, deep thoughts. And have you ever had, a question occur to you like, if God created everything, then where did God come from? Am I the only one? If not, you should have come to the youth group. They did a question and answer night for Pastor Keith like a couple months ago, and that's where they ask all of those questions. They ask questions like exactly like that one. Like, if God created everything, if God started everything, then where did God come from? Now, next time I'm going to tag you, and you're it. You can stand in front of them and you can kind of answer that question. You can figure out, because, right, there is a piece of us that anytime we start thinking about God and we start kind of trying to conceive Him, we start trying to, figure out what do we make sense of God, the universe, things that are way bigger than our understanding. You get to that place, I don't know if you get there, but I get to that place where it starts to make your brain hurt. And you feel like your mind is like bending in these weird places that it feels like it's not supposed to bend in those directions. You're like, how do I? And there's that part of us that's like, I have to figure out how to resolve that. I've got to figure out how to answer that question. I'm the pastor sitting in front of the youth group. I've got to have an answer to every single one of their questions. And my best answer is, I don't know. It hurts my brain to think about things like that. It hurts my brain to think about, and then you start to get into the details of Christianity and the Christian story. It hurts my brain to think about, how is it that the God of the universe, the creator, the uncreated one, the one who began everything without having a beginning himself, entered into this human life and this human story and this human mess and all of our brokenness? How is it that that happened? And that makes my brain hurt too. Some apparent paradoxes are tensions to be managed. And not only are they tensions to be managed on that big scale, like where did God come from, but also when you start to figure out how do we live as followers of Jesus, there are more practical and applicational tensions to be managed inside of our lives. What do we do with things that we're uncertain about? What do we do with things that sometimes feel like, on one hand, here's what I see, and on the other hand, here's what I see, and how do I resolve these? Or do I just have to live with these things in tension inside of my life and inside of my heart and inside of my mind? And those are difficult places for us to live. One of those places, one of those applicational, practical tensions, surfaces in the beginning of John's gospel. It was the very first message that we did in this series, was from John chapter 1, because when John writes his story of Jesus, he begins in a very philosophical, very just eternal kind of this grand picture that he writes. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God in the beginning, and through Him everything was created, and without Him nothing was made that has been made. And all of a sudden our brains start bending, and we start hurting a little bit. We're like, oh, John, ease us into this, like Luke did, like with the, there was Mary and Joseph and the donkey and all that sort of stuff. But one of the tensions that John surfaces at the very beginning of his story is he says that when we saw Jesus, we saw someone who was full of grace and full of truth. And those two words for us a lot of times feel like paradoxes. They feel like different ends of a spectrum that can't really be resolved. Because sometimes when we hear truth and we hear some people say, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and you've had someone at some point or another say, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and you internally braced for what was coming, right? Is that how that works? Right? Like as soon as someone says, I'm just going to tell you the truth, and then if they're a Christian, I'm going to say, I'm going to speak the truth in love to you. But internally you brace because there's a piece of you that feels like sometimes truth gets wielded like a hammer over our heads, right? Or it's this thing that is unyielding and unbending, and sometimes people have used it to become really rigid, judgmental, and very difficult to live with. Sometimes we hear truth, and that's exactly what we hear. And then sometimes we hear grace, and we hear grace just lets you do whatever you want. Grace is just the absence of all rules. Grace is the absence of all truth. Grace is the absence of anything that holds you to any sort of standard or calls you to any sort of accountability. And grace becomes this really relativistic, kind of free-flowing way to live life that has no teeth to it. And that appeals to some of us, and others of us were like, I don't really want that. And these two things that live in apparent tension as apparent paradoxes, John says, when we saw Jesus, we saw someone who lived at the intersection of these two things and held them in tension in a way that we had never seen before, because we were used to seeing people who use truth to beat us over the head like a hammer. And we were used to other people who were saying, grace, grace, grace. It never calls you to account, never changes anything inside of you, just lets you kind of go on as you are. But when we saw Jesus, we saw something that we could not quite explain other than to say he was full of grace and truth and was holding these together in perfect harmony. The story that we're going to read this morning, I think, is possibly one of the great examples in the Gospels of the tension between grace and truth that Jesus lived at. Now, the difficult part. We're going to be in John chapter 7, verse 53. If you have a Bible, if you've got a physical Bible, which some of you have and are carrying with you, there is something at the beginning of John chapter 7, verse 53, that says something along the lines of all of the earliest manuscripts of John's gospel do not include the following 12 verses. All of the most reliable manuscripts of John's gospel, from John chapter 7, verse 53 to John chapter 8, verse 11, the passage that we're going to read from, all of those early manuscripts do not include the following story. All of those early reliable, the most ancient copies of John's gospel do not have these 12 verses in them. So in the spirit of kind of honesty that we've sort of pursued inside of this series, because I think it's important for us to do that, we should talk a little bit about how that happened, right? How did we get here, right? So later on, writers added these verses in to the story of John, and sometimes when they added it in here, where it is in John chapter 7, verse 53 through 8:11. And in some versions, they added it in entirely different places in John's gospel. It's all over John's gospel. And sometimes it's not in the gospel itself. It's almost added on as like a little appendix, like a little bit of a here's one last story that we knew was true about Jesus. So why is it that we have this story inside of John's gospel, and why are we going to talk about it today as if it is an authentic story? So here's this is just my opinion. I don't think John actually wrote this. Some of you are going to get very upset about this. I don't think this is actually John's writing. It doesn't match up with his vocabulary. It doesn't match up with his grammar or any of those sorts of things. In fact, it feels much more like Matthew, Mark, or Luke wrote it, or one of the people that they were collecting stories from had written this story down. But, it does feel like a Jesus story. In fact, it feels like a Jesus story that's very consistent with the things that we hear and see and read about Jesus in all four of the other Gospels. And some of the earliest church fathers knew about this story and refer to it in their own writings. There's a guy, one of the old guys. Now, this is, again, some of you, I lost you. I'll come back to you in a minute. But there's an old guy. Some of you really love this stuff. Some of you are like, I don't care. Whatever, man. Let's get on to the story. But this is important for me. There's an old guy named Papias. Papias is born in 65 AD. So he's born about 30 years after Jesus. He is a couple of generations removed from those first followers of Jesus. He becomes an influential father and bishop, kind of church leader in the early first century. He writes about this story that we're going to read, and he says it's an authentic Jesus story that belongs inside of the Gospels. So, we're taking Papias' word for it. I don't know, you don't know Papias. I don't really know him. I've never met him. Someday I'll meet him. But we're going to take Papias' word as an early church father, a couple of generations removed from the story of Jesus, that this is an authentic Jesus story this morning. So here's how the story goes, now that we got all the nerd stuff out of the way. They went each to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So, what do you say?" And this they said to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Now, in the story, as we've been following it in John's gospel, we're still in Jerusalem around the Feast of Tabernacles, and this is possibly why they decided to insert the story here, because it's connected with the temple, and we were just in the temple vicinity last week. It also feels very much like what you see later on in the Gospels as Jesus' last week approaches, where Jesus would go into the city, teach around the temple, and then he would leave and go out to a place outside, and he would stay there, and then he would come back the next morning. So that's why I don't think it necessarily belongs with John. I think it belongs with one of the other gospel writers, but that's my 2 cents. You do with it what you want. The story, the main piece of the story, is that when Jesus comes back into the temple area and begins to teach again, the scribes, Pharisees, and the religious leaders bring to Jesus and the crowd of people that have gathered around him a woman that they say has been caught in adultery. And their language is very specific and required them to be very specific, because this was, according to the law of Moses, an offense that was punishable by death. And so for them to make this accusation that this woman had been caught in the act of adultery literally meant, I think all the kids are going, oh, well, some teenagers here, you guys can handle this, literally meant that they had witnesses who saw the act of adultery happening. It did not mean that they had some suspicions that 2 people had gone into the house and there was something that was happening inside of the house and then they came out. It did not mean even that they had seen the 2 people laying in the same bed with each other. They had witnesses to the actual act, which begs the question, how did you get the witnesses? How is it that you arranged for this whole thing to happen, knew that it was going to happen, had 2 people, which is what the law required for you to make an accusation like this, who were willing to go and testify to what they had seen? And if you read the story closely, you will recognize that there's something missing from the story, isn't there? Does anybody else get it? All the ladies got it. All the ladies got it. Where is the other guy? Because the act that she is committing requires 2 people. It takes 2 to tango, right? So, what we think happened is they knew a guy. It was like Rhode Island. I got a guy. And here's the thing. We're gonna spring this trap, and we're gonna let you slide. But we're gonna make sure that we make a point out of her. The law says when we have this kind of evidence against this kind of woman, a woman who would do this kind of thing, the law says that we should stone a woman like this. We should take her out of the house. We should bring her out in front of the witnesses, and we should make a public display of her execution so that people would see this is not how we treat our spouses. This is something that God takes seriously. This is something that you as spouses should take seriously with one another and in relationship with one another. This is what the law requires. And what they do, they bring the woman out to Jesus, and essentially what they're saying is, let's have a game. Let's play Moses versus Jesus. Because over here, Moses says we stone a woman like this. And now, Jesus, what do you think? Because we've got some suspicions that you're kind of a liberal. You're one of those like softies, like you're just one of those do-gooders. And you won't want to, carry out a sentence like that against a woman like this. And so we're going to make a point that we stand over here with Moses and you stand over here with a woman such as this. And if you're looking for public perception, you want to be on this side over here. You want to be on the we stand with Moses. We're buttoned up, buttoned down. We got all of our religious ducks in a row. Everything's all good. We are the right kind of people. And if you stand over here with this kind of woman, then what can we say about you over here? Mr. Fast and Loose with the law, and Mr., you're going to teach and relax the Sabbath commandments, and you're going to heal people on the Sabbath, and you're going to allow your disciples to pick grain while they go through the grain fields, and you're going to do all of these sorts of things, but we're going to put you in a place where you can't get out of this. You've got to answer one way or the other. It's a yes or no question, Jesus. Where do you stand? You stand with Moses, or do you stand with the woman caught in the act of adultery? And Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. Jesus, you have to resolve this one way or the other. Where do you stand? Moses, this woman. And Jesus does what he so frustratingly to his opponents must have always seemed to do. And again, this is why it just feels like such a Jesus thing to do. It feels like such an authentic Jesus story from what we know. He says, I'm not going to put myself anywhere. I'm going to let you put yourself somewhere. You decide. You want to resolve this question. You drag this woman. You set this whole thing up so that you could put me in a difficult position. You set this whole thing up. And, by the way, let the guy go drag the woman out here to face all of this public humiliation, all of this public shame for the thing that she's done. You have taken her in the worst moment of her life, and you've brought her out in public, and you've laid the whole story out for everybody. So, I'm not going to answer. I'll let you answer. And here's how I want you to answer. If you are without sin, then you go ahead and throw the first stone. You be the first one. If you've got nothing hidden, you got nothing in your closet, you've got nothing that you've done that you haven't dealt with, then go ahead. It's on you. And then he stooped and wrote in the ground again. And I think Pete and I had this conversation before church. Pete asked me, I gave it away because I like Pete. He was like, well, what do you think he wrote on the ground? It's a great question, isn't it? What do you think he wrote? What was he writing? A lot of different suggestions, a lot of different preachers, a lot of teachers have made all, and all of them are there's all kinds of different compelling arguments that could be made for anything. Here's what I think, and again, this is just my 2 cents. There's a couple other people that think this with me, and I'm dependent on them to think it, but whatever. Here's what I think. If you were trying someone legally, you were to legally try this woman for adultery. When they would bring her before that group that was going to try her, when the sentence was passed, the person before the sentence was passed would write the sentence down. This is what is happening for this woman. And then once the sentence was written, the sentence would be read out loud and then could be carried out. That was the way that things were done still, if you go to a trial, something is written down and then it is read out loud, and it is spoken, and it is confirmed. And I think that what Jesus did in these moments was he wrote down the sentence that he was going to declare over this woman. And the religious leaders are just pestering him constantly. What are you going to say? 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 Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And it manages this tension of grace and truth, doesn't it? Because he doesn't dismiss what the woman has done. He doesn't say, well, that's no big deal. Just, grace, 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 grace. Sprinkle grace everywhere. Just keep going on. Just do whatever you want. And he doesn't take the hammer of truth and smash it over her head, or the stone of truth, as the case may be in this case. He just holds the two in tension. He says, if you're without sin, go ahead and carry out the sentence that you think she deserves. Go ahead and confess publicly that you think that you're the one who could throw the first stone at a woman such as this, because you're over here with Moses, right? There you are. And I'm here. And you want to put me over here. I'm not going to stand over here, and I'm not going to stand over here. I'm just going to stand here. I'm going to let my words speak and my sentence resound, and you guys decide what you want to do. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." The oldest, most respected, most senior of those religious leaders drops his stone, walks away, and the others follow suit because it was a sign of reverence and a sign of respect that this is what we do. If he's not going to stone her, I'm not going to stone her. I'm going to walk out with him. And it leaves Jesus and the woman, and again, at this point, you kind of feel like if you were filming the movie, right? Everything else kind of goes out into the background, and all you see is Jesus and this woman, who is presented to us at what we might imagine is probably feeling the worst and feeling the weight of the worst of what she's done, and feeling the weight of knowing that she's done something that she should not have done. And Jesus looks at her and says, Where'd everybody else go? Where are they? Didn't anyone step forward to throw the first stone? Didn't anyone step forward to condemn you for the worst of yourself? Didn't someone step forward and say, I'll take that first shot? No one's there. And Jesus says what I think he wrote on the ground. Neither do I condemn you. Now, go and sin no more. Recognize the weight of what you've done. Don't repeat. Don't keep going in the same direction. This is truth for you. What you've done is done damage to you. It's done damage to the guy that they let go. It did damage to your husband, did damage to your kid, did all sorts of damage down the line. All that stuff is real and it's true, and it's not like you don't get out of that stuff. But he also says, I'm not going to condemn you. I'm not going to throw the stone. And in the story, in the way that Jesus presents the story, and the way that he presents the sentence, says, the one who's without sin, let him be the one to throw the first stone. And who's the only one in the story who can throw the stone? It's Jesus. And what does he do? So frustrating, right? He doesn't do it. And he doesn't give her just a pass and say, no big deal. This is no big deal. Let's not lose sight of that. It's a big deal. But I'm going to show you grace in the midst of that. I'm going to show you grace at the worst moments of your life. When you feel most the weight of your sinfulness is when we expect, right? Whether we believe it or not, wherever we came from, however you grew up, whatever that voice is that's in the back of your head, you and I tend to feel like at the worst moments of our life, if Jesus was there watching us, he'd be like, oh, really? I can't believe you did, said, acted. I can't believe that you expressed the worst of yourself. And yet, Jesus' sentence over this lady is full of grace and truth on both ends, holding them in beautiful tension, saying, I won't condemn you. Go and sin no more. And it's interesting, right? I think sometimes we think that grace is liberating, and it can be. Grace feels like the removal of all of those restraints. Grace feels like Jesus meeting us at the worst of ourselves and just saying no big deal, but that's not what it says. And sometimes we feel like truth, and we'll see it actually next week, the truth sets you free. It's amazing what happens when we tell the truth, like, or someone tells us the truth and they do it in a way that isn't, the hammer over the head, but that actually is concerned about us and loves us and cares about us. This incredibly liberating piece of truth inside of us. And so if someone can hold together grace and truth and bring those together into your life, it is so incredibly freeing. It is so incredibly and powerfully liberating to see grace and truth together in one person who will see you at your worst and will not condemn you. That is remarkable. That is the kind of thing that made a story like this worth preserving. I don't know all of the ways that it got preserved. I don't know how many times it was told and retold and told and retold and written and rewritten and written and rewritten and inserted in different places in the Gospels and finally found its way to the place where we read it this morning. And I think all that stuff is interesting. It's all compelling. All of that stuff matters. But at the end of the day, the thing that's most compelling to me is this: grace and truth together in this moment are so powerfully liberating for people. This is what we need. We need to encounter Jesus in a way that we see him full of grace and truth. We see him in a way that says, not just brush it past, not just sweep it under the rug, not just let's not worry about it, it's not a big deal. It sees the worst of us and says, yeah, that's a big deal. It is. The worst of you, the worst of me, it's a big deal. We're not going to air it all out today, but it's a big deal. But in the moments when you feel the weight of the worst of yourself, here's what I would encourage you to do. Present yourself to Jesus and say, here I am. This is the truth about me. Not some pretend version, not what I wish I was, not what I hoped I was, not what everyone else thinks I am. This is what I am. Would you, in your grace, meet me in that place not to condemn me, but to set me free? Would you, in your grace, meet me in that place not to cast the stones at me, but to remove all of that burden, remove all of that condemnation, all of that guilt, all of that shame, set me free so that I can live as a monument to your grace and your truth, so that I can live as a living representation of the fact that you see the worst in me and I feel the weight of it. And yet, you don't turn away, you don't push me aside, you meet me there. And in your grace and in your truth, you transform and set me free. That is what I believe Jesus came to do. That's why this story matters. That's why that tension of grace and truth is so important for us to feel for ourselves and to pass on to others. Because it's one thing to feel it for yourself. It's another thing to be the guy holding the stone, ready to throw it at someone else, and hear Jesus' words. If you're without sin, go ahead. If you've never had a moment where you recognize the worst of yourself, then go ahead and throw stones. But if you've had a moment where you saw the worst of yourself and you met Jesus there, guess what? You lost the right to throw stones. Because of all of those stones that could have been thrown at you got dropped, you probably can drop the one that's in your hand. And instead, hold in tension grace and truth together, which are powerful and liberating. Would you pray with me this morning? Jesus, I am grateful that you are so full of grace and truth. I'm grateful that you see the worst in us. You see the worst in me. And you don't pass over it. You don't pretend it doesn't exist. You don't say it's fine and just move on. You see it. You can say it. And yet there, I meet your grace, which restores, forgives, heals, brings back to life even the worst of us. So Jesus, I pray today for some of us who are sitting here this morning and maybe feeling the weight of the worst of ourselves. I pray that there we would meet you full of our grace and truth, and that we would be set free, liberated, transformed by grace and truth together, working on our hearts. We love you so much for who you are. We ask sincerely, humbly, meet us in grace and truth and change us. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.